So I actually did watch the interview with Gucci Mane and Keisha Kaur. And I don't even know if that's her name, or, I know back in the day, all the girls was like Kaor, and it was like a Dior thing, and all the babies was like named Kaor and Kari and all those things. So I don't even know if that's her name, which I'm sure it's not. Like, I think Keisha Kaor sounds more like a stage name versus like a real name. Like, it kind of seems like a perfect pairing with Gucci Mane, right? But I actually have Gucci Mane's original biography, I think it was one of his first books, in my thrift books wish list, right? And I'm gonna flex a little bit and just say that I am a literary elite member on thrift books, so highly recommend. This is not an ad though, but I feel like one day it would be nice to get a thrift books ad, because I am definitely a valued customer. All right, 10 out of 10 recommend for your books and all of your curious reads. And okay, let me just So anyway, I have the book because there was this book page or book talk or whatever you want to call it I followed on TikTok at one point, and they were just kind of talking about how Gucci Mane's biography, or his memoir rather, was really good. And so I was like, oh, that's interesting, because I'm familiar with Gucci Mane. I had a couple, Gucci Mane songs in my little MP3 back in the day, those little iPods that was just like, you just press next and you would download the music on your computer, and you wouldn't download it. You would have your friend download it, and they would bring it to school the next day. And, then it kind of evolved, and the iPod got a screen, and it was, so, I'm a little dated, your girl's a little dated, you know what I mean? I remember those days where it was really just like an MP3, but Gucci Mane was on my MP3, and so I'm a little familiar with Gucci Mane. But anyway, seeing the interview on The Breakfast Club, and one, it's really hard, I think, with celebrities, because again, I don't know who came up with this and who said it first, but and it might have been Kanye West actually, but I don't want to say he said it first, but there's really is some truth in being a public figure and being a celebrity, and the cost of that, right? The price of fame, and being this person who really is a bit of a spectacle, and you are seen as the person in the glass box, right? So we can see you, we admire your life, but it's more so through the lens of examination, right? You're never really humanized in any real way. And so even for myself, I noticed the level of skepticism I had when Gucci Mane was talking about, being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and just how I felt as though the conversation was just had so casually. I know that, people can have schizophrenia, and if you have the appropriate support systems, it's one of the mental health diagnoses that I do think will allow for some level of functionality. So I know that just because people have mental illness doesn't mean that they are, entirely inept from self-expression or articulation. But I understand that there's a level of functionality, right? But I do think there was a level of casualty, speaking about something that I think is probably, I wouldn't say that it's probably one of the most devastating or most harmful or most, I don't even know what the word is. I don't want to say derailing, because I just think that my words are kind of failing me right now. But I do think that it is it's a hard disease. I think schizophrenia that's a tough one, and I don't know. I think in part, you have this ability, which I think for a lot of African-American men specifically, I think there's an element of having to be tough and having to be cool, right? And so here you are talking about something as serious as your mental health and something as serious as schizophrenia, but you're having to do it with this very cool, like, undertone, And so I think that that's more so what it is that kind of comes off, not necessarily disingenuous, but it just kind of takes some of the edge off of the severity. And I think that's something that we do as African-American people, given all that we've had to endure within this country, given all that we must continue to endure and triumph. I think we've always kind of had to have a level of detachment, from our experiences, because there really is no space for our vulnerabilities, for our disabilities, right, to go, so we really do have to be cool, calm, composed, and pretty much always together despite what happens to us. And I think that is probably one of the things that contributes to our resilience, but I also think it's another thing that contributes to a lot of the anger and the suppression that goes on within our community and in our relationships, right? You talk about this level of violence. Well, I even know from myself, I realized throughout the years, I said, wow, it's not that I have anger problems. I'm hurt, I'm sad, but there's no way for me to be sad, right? There's no space for me to be sad. I have to be tough, right? And so a lot of times that comes out as being angry. And I think that's something that's just very common amongst African-American people. And so in watching the interview, of course, I was looking at the comments and everyone's like, oh, all these conspiracies and things like that. And I never realized just how ignorant people really are. And I'm just going to be blatant, like the things that people say. I mean, I just never understood conspiracy theorists. I just never have. I've never really been someone who's a conspiracy. Like, I think even before, being at this point in my life where I've a little bit more well-rounded than I was as a teenager or whatever, getting older, right? Coming out of the dream state of adolescence, right? Like, I've just never been somebody who was like a big conspiracy theorist. Like, I just think it is so absolutely ridiculous. There was nothing about conspiracies that really intrigued my imagination. It was never anything I could really sit and kind of toy with and engage with, because I just never found it to be interesting. I think and maybe because I don't read a lot of fiction books, I always say that, when you talking about imagination, but I wouldn't say that I was void of imagination. I just never really cared to conjure up all of the possibilities of what could go wrong and what is going wrong with the world without actually seeing it. I think conspiracy theorists are people who have very little experience in life. And I think they are people who have very little courage and curiosity to genuinely find out the truth and what's going on in life and in the world and in the systems, right? They're not the people who are going to run for Congress, right? They're not the people who are going to, I was going to say get jobs in the government. Actually, we're not going to go there. It's a little bit of a dark sense of humor, but I also know that this is a very, very crazy time. So I'm not going to be insensitive. There you go. That detachment, that thing that we do sometimes as African Americans and people who have been through things psychologically, we kind of twist things for humor and we make it, we make laughter out of it. Okay, let me get back. So that's just never really been my thing. And I think that's probably one of the biggest hindrances about conspiracy theorists. And I think that's probably one of the things I really dislike about conspiracy theorists is I think they are just people who are just full of ideas with very little experience, very little exposure, and they're not actually willing to get out in the world and do anything and actually figure out for themselves what the truth is. They just kind of sit around, toy with ideas all day, and they do it under the guise of philosophy and being someone who knows the truth, when the reality is that they're just deeply afraid, right? They're afraid of actually living and, even possibly finding out that, all these ideas are just that, there really is no conspiracy once you get to the other side of things, Okay. So anyway, I watched the interview. And something that I thought about, and some other commentator mentioned that he just kind of spoke about how Black women are expected to endure so much in relationships. And you guys know, if you've been listening to my podcast, I do not like to go down this path where we just kind of regurgitate a lot of the cultural and communal injustices, especially when you start talking about relational dynamics in regards to Black women and Black men. I really try to stray away from that as much as I possibly can and just try to create a space of community, to create somewhat of a healthy environment where we just don't bring all the baggage, to be honest, and it's not necessarily avoidance. It's just more so preserving Blackness, Black love, Black representation in terms of relational dynamics. I just don't really care to put all that on the forefront. But something I was thinking about after watching that interview and just thinking about people who do find themselves in relational dynamics where you are a bit of a caretaker. And honestly, when you start talking about things like marriage, right? One, I actually don't think most people should get married. I spoke with someone on my comment section on a video once talking about marriage and just great supporter left a really great comment, just kind of talking about how most people shouldn't get married because it's not for everybody. You start talking about through sickness and in health, through death and life, through riches and for poverty, and you're dealing with someone who has a very strong sense of self and strong sense of faith. And just, there's really something about internal strength that often goes unnoticed. And I just don't think that a lot of people can withstand that, right? You start talking about marriage. Well, really what you're talking about is someone who has self-control, someone who has discipline, right? I was thinking about this last night as, they're shutting down Snap. And I'm not necessarily going to be pertaining what I'm about to say to snap and the government shut down. But I was thinking about why so many people are unhappy, right? For me, I share the story all the time. Just growing up in a small town, you drive through any city, you can find the Black people. And granted, that's not necessarily where I reside, but at the same time, I'm immersed in this environment, right? And so when you come from these rural or urban environments where there's a lot of African Americans, where there's a lot of poverty, right? There's a lack of education, there's a lack of material resources. You're dealing with a lot of unhappy people. And I realized that, you start talking about faith and things like that, like how God never promised us riches, right? God's riches, which if you don't know, but God's riches are things like joy, love, right? And so the world kind of says things like, well, you can be with someone, if you guys are dead broke and love is enough, right? But it's more so a misconception, right? Because we obviously know with the world taints things that are like holy, things like love or whatever. And I don't want to go all off on a, religious tangent, but I'm gonna. So just stick with me here. And so, the world says, well, we can be broke and, we can still be in love and, all these different things. But the reality is that for most people, and myself included, right, this is a lot of us, right? Because without this level of consciousness, without, if you are someone who's a practicer of faith, then you would say the Holy Spirit or whatever. When you don't have certain convictions, you don't have certain disciplines, you don't have this ability to be so self-aware and sacrificial in an intentional way, you can't really yield to love, And so what that looks like is that anytime somebody does something that you don't like, that you don't, whatever the case may be, then you don't love them anymore, right? But God's love is the thing that doesn't fail, right? It can't fail. It will never fail. And I'm not referring this to, Keisha Kayor and Gucci Mane. But one thing I will say is when you think about all that this woman has endured, and this is not to say love can't exist and relationships don't have their ups and downs. No, that's not at all what I'm saying. I'm just saying, I think when you start talking about things like money, right? You start talking about marriage, especially when it's something that is so intertwined. I mean, you've been with someone for years. Like, divorce is just no joke. Like, I'm not here to push anything. Quite frankly, I'm just more so talking. I'm actually not, because I think sometimes when we have conversations, people look for some type of definitive. I don't have a definitive on their relationship, right? I'm just here making a podcast, sharing my thoughts, doing what I do, right? And so I'm not here to say like what the definitive should be in regards to their relationship. I don't know their relationship, right? And I don't want to be so, so not definitive. But when you start thinking about things like money and divorce, it gets a little complicated. But when you think about all that, she has endured, right? The stuff that she shared, I think in many ways, if it's not your like personal MO, to be somebody who's sturdy, I think that can wear anybody out. I think that can wear anybody down. I think being a Black person who has a mental illness or you're struggling with mental health in general, it's very rare to even have people who do care about you and to have caretakers, right? I wrote about this on my Medium column, kind of exploring this, I think in 2024, which was probably last year, or 2023, where I just kind of spoke about whether or not Black people have the ability to be mentally ill. In many cases, I think the answer is no, right? If you look at it from a historical context, from the first asylums, African Americans were always kind of put into asylums post-slavery. I think they called it drapetomania, where they were saying that we were essentially depressed without our slave owners, not realizing that we were depressed because we were free from the plantation and literally set out into the world with absolutely nothing when there was civilization and we had nothing, right? And so I think when you start talking about Black mental health and just the complexities of that, how in so many different so many different spheres, specifically the medical sphere, there is no resources and no safe haven. There's no safe place to land. There's not a lot of advocates for African Americans. Like, if you are someone who is struggling with mental health and you don't have someone who has your best interest, you absolutely could lose everything, And so I do think, to an extent, not necessarily just looking at it from a relational dynamic, but to an extent, I think what she has done and what she shared about his mental health and just being there for him as his his wife and his partner, as his, medical advocate, I think it's admirable, because for many people, that's just not their story, right? If something goes wrong with you, for most African Americans, you're pretty much done for, right? It's like whatever, your family is still working, right? They've got their own responsibilities. Life goes on. You take into consideration things like poverty and people who do want money from you, or may just want, the benefits of having you as a dependent, so it just gets tricky. But I do think overall, like, I wonder what the end result will be for her. Because like I said, I just think it's one of those things to where, I don't know, that's a tough thing. I think you can absolutely like lose yourself in that. And I think that goes for anybody who's a caretaker, I think mental health is something that is very serious. I think that that's what I was saying in regards to the SNAP. And I was thinking about last night, and not pertaining to SNAP specifically. And I went on to talk about being in an urban community. And I'm about to wrap up here, but being in an urban community, being in a small Black town, just how many people are unhappy. And so I started talking about scripture and things like that. But to kind of bring it all full circle, because I think I've veered far too left with this podcast episode, because I never really had a premise. I don't really know where I was going with this. But I think it takes wisdom to know how to live a good life, and I think for many people, it is really finding happiness in a little things. But I think as it pertains to mental health, you have to do things, and you have to be so intentional about what you do with your life, what you do with your body, right? With your free will, so to speak. You want to do good, right? You want to do the right thing when no one is looking. You want to treat people how you would want to be treated, even when people aren't always fair to you. Because I do believe that there is really something about that level of discipline, that level of steadfastness in righteousness, right? And being a good person, and at least trying to be a good person, that I think will really help carry you through life storms, right? I do believe that when you put good out, I think good comes back to you. I don't think it always comes back in the way that you may envision, but we do have to recognize, like, even for example, with Gucci Mane or whatever, I think Gucci has shared how he's, I think I don't want to say he's committed murder. I don't want to just be assumptive, but, he's done a lot of bad, and it's not to say that, look, he's struggling because of what he's done, but I do think there's really something from a psychological perspective, from a spiritual perspective, right, that there is some interlinkings between consciousness and our behaviors, right? The things that we do, and how, when we do wrong, it really eats away at that spiritual piece, that interconnectedness that we may have from mind, body, and soul, right? Like, I think that it's not always like, and I'm not trying to go too deep here, right, on this philosophical tangent, but I do think that when you do good, and I think when you live your life in such a way that there's stability, right? Your basic needs are met. You have healthy relationships. You surround yourself with positivity, right? And like we talk about, being around persons who are impoverished and who are unhappy, how it's detrimental to your mental health, because it's really the little things that I think make for a beautiful life, right? And I was getting to that, but I'm just trying to get my thoughts together. You have to be grateful for the little things, because like I said, riches is not promised, right? So it's like your health, it's like your youth, it's, some of the things that you may have that are desirable. It's your ability to articulate yourself. It's your love for reading, or whatever the case may be. It's those things, those little tiny things that you can notice on a daily basis that really add up to something that is insurmountable, like joy. In your real life. And I think it's by doing good to others, by being somebody who's upright, by staying on a path of integrity, that I think really play into your mental health. Now, obviously, you start taking into consideration things like trauma. I do think that trauma and things like that could play a huge role in creating certain ailments in the brain. And I think that obviously can kind of create an ailment in your spirit as well. And so, it's all kind of interlinked. But I guess overall, I think it will be interesting to kind of see what Keisha's perspective will be. We may not hear from that perspective. Maybe once Gucci Mane passes away, maybe not. We never got anything from Mrs. King. We never got anything from, we never got anything from other women who've kind of endured certain things and who have gone through certain things. Well, we are getting something from Michelle Obama, although, I still just think to this day, we just don't need a podcast from Mrs. Obama. That's just what I feel. I just feel like she should be one of those, anyway. I guess that's my summary. My summary is, what it is to live a good life, what it is to be a person have a mental illness, and what it is to, I don't know. I think we're going to end there because I just don't know if this podcast ever really had any real definition. I guess I just kind of wanted to come on here and chat. I wanted to kind of share my thoughts. And we spoke about a lot. We spoke about conspiracies. And I think on some level, as we conclude this podcast, I do think much of what we spoke about, although unfinished, was connected. So I hope you guys enjoyed this tangent. Peace.